Howzit Grant here, and welcome to this camera comparison between the standard Galaxy S22 running the Snapdragon chipset up against the Google Pixel 6 Pro with its own custom Tensor chipset. Now, the S22 starts at a retail price of $799 here in the US, and the Pixel 6 Pro is starting at $899. So I think this is going to be a closer camera comparison than most people think, just because the S22 is the standard model, not the Plus or the Ultra, but they both have some fairly comparable camera systems, so let's go ahead and check them out. Now, both use 50 megapixel Samsung sensors, with the S22 opting for the slightly smaller GN5 and the Pixel 6 Pro going with the slightly larger GN1 sensor. Now, both phones have 12 megapixel ultra wide angle cameras, but the Pixel will probably have the advantage with the telephoto lens, going with a larger 48 megapixel sensor with 4 times optical zoom, and the S22 opting for a slightly more traditional, smaller 10 megapixel sensor and 3 times optical zoom, but it will have the advantage from the front-facing cameras, with the S22 shooting up to 4K 60 frames per second fully stabilized video, while the Pixel is limited to 1080p 30 frames per second video from the front-facing camera. But all those are just specs, and so all that really matters is how do the cameras really look. So go ahead and take a look at all the photos and videos for yourself, and let me know what you think. So here's a rear camera video test from the Galaxy S22 and Pixel 6 Pro. As you can see, they are both recording from the rear facing cameras. And this is with the ultra wide angle lens at their max resolution and frame rates, which is 4K on each, but 60 frames per second on the S22 and only 30 frames per second on the Pixel 6 Pro. The ultra wide angle camera cannot shoot in 4K 60 on the Pixel 6 Pro. So I'm just gonna pan around here to give you a feel side by side for how these ultra wide angle cameras compare in this particular setting in the park here. Lots of greens and blues, so check out the color reproduction and the differences there on both of these ultra wide angle cameras. And I'm gonna stop the video and come back at 4K 60 on the main camera on each. All right, so we're back with the main cameras here, and they're both at 4K 60 frames per second here. So again, I'm gonna do the same thing. I'll just pan around to give you a feel for how these main cameras compare here in this particular setting. Check out all the colors and the exposure here, especially with that harsh afternoon sunlight. You can see how that looks here. And we'll pan up and pan to the right. And we'll test out zoom on that cell tower. So on the Pixel 6 Pro, there is no telephoto lens access here when filming at 4K 60. I'll show you 4K 30 where you can. So really you've got like this 2x digital zoom here on the Pixel, and then we can move into maybe like a 2x on the S22 just to compare. And the Pixel will max out at only a 7x digital zoom here at 60 frames per second. And let's go into 7x equivalent here on the S22. And this can go all the way up to a max 10x digital zoom there on the S22 at 4K 60. So that's the max zooms here on each of the two phones. And so we're back still at 4K 60, but this time with the 3x telephoto lens on the S22. You gotta stop the video to change the cameras at 4K 60 on the S22. So this is the 3x telephoto lens on the Galaxy, and this is 3x digital on the Pixel 6 Pro. And of course the Pixel 6 Pro can still only go up to 7x digital zoom here at 4K 60 frames per second. And the S22 from this telephoto lens can go all the way up to a 12x zoom. So there's the max zooms here on each of the two phones at 4K 60. Right, so let's test autofocus here on the post at 4K 60. So first with the S22, so they go focused up and away and refocus again. So pretty snappy looking autofocus here on the Galaxy S22, although maybe a little bit longer than that one. So there we go. Let's try with the Pixel 6 Pro. So there we go. Pretty snappy autofocus, maybe a little bit faster here on the Pixel 6 Pro. Really nice shallow depth of field or nice natural background blur as well. Let's go ahead and test stabilization by walking down the stairs here. So we can see what that looks like here at 4K 60 frames per second side by side here. And let's go ahead and start jogging, maybe just to stress out that stabilization a bit. And we'll pull up here and pan up into the afternoon sky so you can see how to adjust the exposure for that really bright sun. All right, so we're back at 4K 30 frames per second now, so we can test out the telephoto lens. You have access to that at 4K 30 frames per second on each. So on the Pixel 6 Pro, here's the 4x telephoto lens here. You can see it snap in right there. So change lenses. This is now the telephoto lens on the Pixel 6 Pro. And we have a 3x telephoto lens here on the S22. And now the Pixel 6 can go all the way up to a 20x digital here. You can see what that looks like. And the S22 is still at a 12x digital zoom. So that's the max zoom and what the telephoto zoom looks like here on both phones. Alright, so here's a low light video test from the Galaxy S22 and Google Pixel 6 Pro. This is the ultra wide angle lens on each at 4K 30 frames per second. So I'm just going to pan around to give you a side-by-side view of how these ultra wide angle cameras compare. Obviously, as you can see, the S22 has the wider field of view. It can fit more in the frame than the ultra wide angle camera on the Pixel. So let's go ahead and start moving into the main lens right now. So there you go on the Pixel, and then on the S22. So now we're on the main lens. You can see picture probably brightened up a little bit on these main lenses. They're going to let in more light. Should be brighter than the ultra wide angle cameras, and because of that, you can see they flare out that really bright street light more than the ultra wide angle cameras did. And let's go ahead and pan around this way, and we'll start walking to test the stabilization on these cameras, as well as to move over to a more difficult or darker lighting condition, so you can kind of compare and contrast from that pretty good light that we were in back there over to some more difficult or darker area and what that looks like. Also, to pay attention to any kind of micro jitters in destabilization. That tends to be more pronounced in some low light here. And as you're around the corner, it's definitely much darker, but what I can see in the viewfinder is that they're both trying to brighten up the scene a lot more than what it looks like here with my own eyes, which is expected. And because of that, you might see more noise. And as you pan up into the night sky, like I always say, there is some light pollution here, so it's not 100% pitch black dark. You can actually see some stars in the sky. The cameras are kind of picking that up, I think. If you pan over here this way, it's a bit of a mixed lighting situation where it's not completely really lit, but it's darker down that alleyway. You've got some lights accenting off this building, so you can see how each of these cameras are handling this particular scene here. So there you go, low light video test on both phones. Alright, so we're back with the main cameras, still at 4K 30 frames per second, but now we're in Pro mode on the Galaxy S22, and I've dialed down the exposure on the Pixel 6 Pro with that exposure slider. So now you can see they're not flaring out the light as much, and things are a little bit darker. They're not as bright right now. It's closer to what I'm seeing with my own eyes. And if we pan this way, we'll do the same test. We'll walk and we'll go and check out that darker area again. And so it should look a little bit darker, a little bit more like what I'm seeing in real life. And it really reduces a lot of that noise from a lot of that aggressive ISO in auto mode on both of these phones. And so already you can see it's getting darker, and it's looking much darker than it did the first time around in full auto mode on both of these. And so even though the Pixel doesn't have a Pro mode, it does give you that exposure slider, the white balance slider, to adjust it. So now it's a lot darker, a lot less noise, much closer to what I'm seeing with my own eyes. Even in this night sky, much less noise there. And down this alleyway, you can see that's definitely closer to what it's looking like right now. Definitely pretty dark. You've got some of these barely lit lights coming off the building there. So you can adjust the image to your liking in video on both phones. So if you don't like it super bright and you want it more natural looking, night to look like night, you do have some options on both phones here. Alright, so here's a low light video test from the front facing cameras on the Galaxy S22 and Pixel 6 Pro. This is being shot at 4K 30 frames per second. The Galaxy S22 can shoot at 60 frames per second from the front facing camera, but like I always say, it's going to be too dark here in low light, and I personally don't prefer it. And On the Pixel 6 Pro, I've dialed down the exposure, so it shouldn't be as noisy. This front-facing camera tends to be really noisy in low light, and so it's nice that they give you the exposure slider. Tone that down, so it should be looking a little bit better here on the Pixel. And the Pixel also has its speech enhancement turned on, so pay attention to the audio compared here to the Galaxy S22. So I'm starting in my usual testing spot in some pretty good lighting conditions because I want to show you what both of these front-facing cameras can do in some fairly optimal light. And as you start walking, you'll see what the stabilization looks like here side by side. But it'll also give us a chance to move to a more difficult light condition, a little bit darker area, so you can compare and contrast and see what a bit more darker situation looks like here versus that pretty well-lit area. I'm also passing a water fountain to my right, so we can test out the speech enhancement feature on the Pixel 6 Pro and if it's canceling out that background noise, and how it sounds compared to the Galaxy S22. And if you pan all the way around, you'll see the really bright streetlights behind me, and the S22 is probably filling out a little bit more than the Pixel 6 Pro is, although both not doing horribly bad considering how bright those lights are. And if we move back into this darker area, you can see what this looks like here side by side in this lighting situation. And you know, the S22 is trying to brighten things up a little bit more than the Pixel because it turned the exposure down on the Pixel. But overall, a little bit grainy, I think, probably on both. But considering front-facing camera and the lighting situation, not horribly bad here. So that's going to do it for this camera comparison between the standard Galaxy S22, not the Plus, not the Ultra. Again, Snapdragon version up against the Pixel 6 Pro here. So let me know what you think and how the S22 did compared to the Pixel 6 Pro. Personally, for me, I still prefer shooting photos with my Pixel. I still like the photography that comes out of the Pixel, even though it's not as flexible as the Galaxy S22. So if you want more control, S22 has full Pro mode. It's got Expert RAW. So really great control if you want to be more creative and have more control over your photos and videos. The Pixel 6 Pro has at least the exposure sliders and white balance sliders for both photos and videos. No Pro mode. You can shoot in RAW on the Pixel, so if you do want to do that and edit in post, you do have that feature available on the Pixel as well. So I think it's just going to come down to how you prefer to shoot. Point and shoot, you want more control. If you want more control, definitely go with the S22. Point and shoot, Pixel's going to give you great results. And I think you can still shoot in RAW and get that post control if you want it. So it's going to just come down to what you personally prefer and how you personally like to use your smartphone cameras. But that's just my quick summary and my opinion here. Let me know what you think and which one you preferred in this particular comparison. And if you have any other questions that I can help answer about either of these phones, drop them as a comment as well. I'll try to answer what I can. And as always, thanks for watching.